August 1945. The air above the camp shimmered in the dry Midwestern heat as a Japanese prisoner of war named Hiroshi Tanaka wrapped his calloused hands around a dented metal cup. His fingers trembled, though not from cold, for the cup itself was icy. Beads of condensation dripped onto his wrist, a sensation so alien it startled him. Inside the cup, a dark liquid fizzed and crackled with bubbles that danced upward in a strange, sparkling rhythm. The American guard had called it Coca-Cola, a name that meant nothing to Tanaka, who had expected either bitter tea or plain water. When he raised it to his lips and tasted the sharp, sweet bite, it felt as if lightning had shot down his throat and burst open in his stomach. He nearly dropped the cup, coughing, as his fellow prisoners watched in stunned silence. Around him, men who had faced death without flinching now gawked at bottles that seemed filled with amber light, at hamburgers wrapped in white paper, at long strips of golden potatoes served in cardboard cartons. Some whispered prayers as though fearing a trick. Others stared at the guards, waiting for the cruelty they had been told to expect. None of them could comprehend what they were seeing. Just months earlier, these men had fought in the jungles of Saipan, on the beaches of the Philippines, on remote islands where a single grain of rice was cherished like treasure. They had been raised on stories of American weakness, told that surrender meant torture, starvation, or dishonor worse than death. Yet here they sat at wooden picnic tables under the blazing Wisconsin sun, offered food and drink so abundant it seemed obscene. The smell of grilled meat wafted through the air, rich and heavy, unlike anything they had known in years of war rations. A guard, barely older than the prisoners themselves, carried a tray stacked with sandwiches, setting them down with the same casual ease one might deliver firewood. Tanaka's stomach clenched with hunger, but his hand froze midway. He wondered if this was poison or some elaborate method of humiliation. His heart pounded, not from fear of combat, but from the incomprehensible realization that he was being treated with a generosity his own country could never imagine showing its enemies. The scene felt unreal, like a dream conjured by fever. The American guards lounged in the shade, smoking cigarettes and sipping from bottles without care, tossing half-eaten food into bins as though it were worthless. Tanaka could not tear his eyes from the trash, where scraps of bread, slices of meat, and unfinished drinks lay discarded. Back in Japan, his younger sister had written him letters about scouring the fields for weeds to make soup, about neighbors boiling pine bark to quiet their children's hunger. Here, even refuse overflowed with riches. A fellow prisoner beside him muttered that surely it was a trick. Another clenched his jaw and refused to eat, whispering that to consume enemy food was to betray the emperor. But hunger gnawed at them all, and one by one they yielded, lifting the unfamiliar sandwiches to their mouths. The taste was salty, greasy, overwhelming, and yet oddly satisfying. For men who had survived on rice balls and dried fish, the rush of fat and flavor was intoxicating. Tanaka chewed slowly, each bite dragging him deeper into a truth he could not escape. The Americans did not fear waste because they had more than enough. They did not ration sugar or meat as if it were sacred, because they could produce more tomorrow. The simple meal in front of him revealed what years of propaganda had hidden. He had been fighting a nation that lived in a different reality, a place where factories and farms could flood the world with abundance. He stared at the bubbles rising in his drink, fizzing with endless energy, and he felt something crack inside him. For the first time, the iron certainty that Japan could still win flickered and died. Later that evening, as the sun dropped behind the horizon and the camp lights flicked on one by one, Tanaka lay awake on his bunk. The metallic taste of Coca-Cola still lingered on his tongue, haunting him. He thought of the comrades who had chosen death over capture, convinced that surrender meant degradation. He wondered what they would have thought of this world, where enemies were fed like honored guests, where a man could sip a cold drink while his homeland burned. The war was not lost on the battlefield, he realized. It was lost here, in the quiet humiliation of seeing with his own eyes that America possessed not only weapons and soldiers, but a river of endless resources that no sacrifice could match. That night, Hiroshi Tanaka understood that his empire had been defeated long before he stepped into this camp. The first taste of Coca-Cola had told him more about the war's outcome than any battle ever could. The memory of that first sip lingered like a ghost, but the shock deepened the next morning when Tanaka and the others were marched to the mess hall. The building itself felt less like a prison and more like a machine, designed to feed thousands with clockwork efficiency. Long rows of tables stretched beneath electric lights that burned without flickering, indifferent to the rising sun outside. Industrial stoves hissed, mechanical mixers churned, and the smell of bread baking drifted through the air so thick and comforting that some prisoners closed their eyes and wept. A sergeant barked orders, not in cruelty but in routine, directing cooks who ladled scrambled eggs, poured milk, and stacked trays with fresh fruit. Tanaka hesitated again, unable to reconcile the world he had known with the one he now saw. Back in the Pacific, meals had been an exercise in survival. A rice ball wrapped in a strip of seaweed, if one was fortunate. Dried fish so brittle it cracked like wood. Often it was nothing more than boiled weeds or a handful of foraged roots. Soldiers scrounged in abandoned villages or combed jungles for anything edible. Hunger was constant, a shadow that stalked every patrol, every battle, every night huddled under canvas or palm leaves. They fought on empty stomachs, their strength dwindling as the war dragged on. Commanders told them spirit would fill the void, that willpower could replace calories. But here, in this mess hall, the Americans had obliterated that illusion with butter, milk, and steaming piles of food so plentiful that trays overflowed. The numbers alone staggered the imagination. American factories produced billions of cans of meat, fruit, and vegetables every year, a torrent of food packaged in metal and shipped across oceans. They had transformed farms into engines of production, mechanized harvests, and shipped grain in quantities that dwarfed Japan's entire annual output. It was not just food, it was logistics refined into art, a supply chain that spanned from Midwestern fields to Pacific islands, delivering abundance with the same precision as bullets or bombs. Tanaka, chewing a slice of bread softer than anything he had tasted before, realized that every bite carried with it a reminder of Japan's futility. His nation had sent young men to fight with rice balls in their packs, while America sent theirs with chocolate, cigarettes, and coffee. The contrast was unbearable. One prisoner, a former officer who had lectured his men about Bushido, sat frozen before a tray piled with eggs, fruit, and bacon. He whispered that it must be a test, that the guards were watching to see if they would betray their honor by eating. But when the hunger overcame him and he took a bite, his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of defeat pressed him into the bench. Around him, others ate in silence, the clatter of trays and utensils punctuating their shame. They knew they were consuming more in one morning than their families back home might see in a month. They could not escape the thought that every grain of rice in Japan was rationed, every potato fought over, while their captors treated food as inexhaustible. Tanaka stared at the guards and noticed their indifference. They ate quickly, talking about baseball and girls back home, leaving half-drunk cups of coffee behind. To them, this was routine, nothing special. To him, it was unbearable proof of a chasm that no bravery could bridge. The war had demanded sacrifice, had demanded that men like him bleed and die for the emperor, while his enemy waged it with full stomachs and infinite supplies. In that mess hall, Among the smell of bacon and the hiss of frying pans, Tanaka grasped the cruel truth. Courage could not overcome hunger, and spirit could not defeat an empire of factories. When he returned to his barracks, his diary trembled in his hands as he wrote down the words he dared not speak aloud. We are beaten not by their weapons, but by their abundance. We are not soldiers against soldiers, but peasants against a nation of machines. Today I ate like a king. Tomorrow I will eat the same. And in this I see the end of everything we believed. The ink smeared where his hand shook, the shame of nourishment weighing heavier than any wound. For the first time, he understood that defeat was not merely on the battlefield, but inside his stomach, in every bite that reminded him of what Japan could never provide. The shock of food had shaken their faith, but it was in the camp hospital that the final fragments of pride began to crumble. Hiroshi Tanaka was led there after a fever struck him down one humid afternoon. He had expected the kind of crude infirmary he knew from the front: bamboo cots, reused bandages stiff with old blood, and doctors who whispered apologies because there was nothing left to give. Instead, he was guided into a building humming with electricity, where the floors gleamed and the air smelled faintly of antiseptic. A young American medic pressed a thermometer into his mouth. Another wrapped a blood pressure cuff around his arm. Stainless steel trays lined the walls, instruments gleaming as though forged from silver. Cabinets overflowed with bottles labeled in neat English letters. When his fever spiked, a nurse injected him with a clear liquid that cooled his burning skin within hours. Penicillin, they called it, a miracle drug that Tanaka had only heard rumors of, whispered among Japanese medical officers who lamented that their nation could not produce enough even for generals. Here it was given to him, an enemy prisoner, without hesitation. The humiliation cut deeper than any wound. In the Pacific, comrades had died from infections that spread from the smallest cuts. Men had lost limbs to gangrene because there were no antibiotics, no sterile supplies. Bandages were boiled and reused until they fell apart in bloody threads. Surgeons worked by lantern light, their hands shaking as they rationed sulfur drugs that had long since expired. Yet here, in the heart of his enemy's land, Tanaka watched as American doctors treated even trivial wounds with resources that Japan could only dream of. A scratch received penicillin, a cough received tablets in sealed bottles. He remembered a comrade on Saipan, shrapnel buried in his leg. They had nothing to offer but sake for the pain and a bayonet to amputate. The man died screaming under a sky filled with American planes. Now Tanaka lay on a clean bed, white sheets tucked under his body, the ceiling above him glowing with electric light that never dimmed. His fever subsided, not by prayer or luck, but by science and abundance. Other prisoners whispered the same astonishment. One officer, his arm shattered in battle, stared in disbelief as an American surgeon fitted him with metal pins and clean plaster. He muttered that in Tokyo, even the most prestigious hospitals could not have offered such treatment in 1945. A Navy aviator, burned across his chest, gasped when nurses placed gauze that did not stick to his wounds, soothing them with ointments he had never seen. For these men, raised to believe that America was decadent, the truth was unbearable. The enemy's mercy was delivered with a precision and wealth of resources their homeland could not match for its own sons. The comparison gnawed at Tanaka. Japan's hospitals in the final year of war were stripped bare. Civilians scrounged for herbs, soldiers died untreated, and even the emperor's armies suffered from shortages so severe that officers begged families for bandages. Yet here, in a camp filled with defeated enemies, there was no shortage, no rationing. The Americans had so much that they extended it to those who had tried to kill them. Tanaka wrote again in his diary, the words tasting like ashes. If they can waste penicillin on prisoners, what must they give their own soldiers? If they treat enemies with such abundance, How can we pretend to match them? Our bodies fail while theirs are healed. We speak of honor, but honor cannot stop infection. Spirit cannot cure disease. Against factories that produce medicine like bullets, our sacrifice is nothing. That night, he lay awake listening to the hum of electric fans and the soft footsteps of nurses on the polished floor. He realized the war was not simply lost in the skies above Tokyo or the seas around Okinawa. It was lost in the hospitals, in the supply chains, in the warehouses overflowing with medicine. The Americans had conquered not only the battlefield but the very fragility of the human body. And for the first time, Tanaka understood with cold clarity Japan's fight had been doomed from the moment the first vial of penicillin rolled off an American assembly line. When Tanaka's fever broke and he was released back into the routine of camp life, another shock awaited him, one that seemed almost comical at first, until its meaning sank in like a blade. A week later, he was assigned to kitchen duty, a task he imagined would involve peeling potatoes or scrubbing greasy pans. Instead, the American cook handed him a metal lever and gestured toward a gleaming machine that hummed with a strange, steady rhythm. A refrigerated drum rotated inside, steam drifting from pipes that hissed softly, and beside it stood boxes of sugar, cream, and fruit extracts. The guard said one word in broken Japanese, "ice cream." Tanaka froze, certain he had misunderstood. Ice cream was a luxury whispered about in pre-war Tokyo, a treat seen only in department stores, if at all. It was something children dreamed of, something civilians would never taste again after 1941. Yet here, in the middle of Wisconsin, in a prison for enemies of the United States, he was being ordered to help prepare it in quantities so large that buckets of the frozen sweetness rolled out by the hour. The Americans were not only feeding their prisoners, they were giving them desserts. He watched in disbelief as his fellow captives were handed scoops of the frozen treat in paper cups, some staring at it as if it might vanish. A few refused, muttering that it was a trick, that no enemy would waste such resources on men who had fought to the death only months earlier. But hunger and curiosity eroded suspicion. One by one they tasted, and the silence broke into murmurs of astonishment. Tanaka lifted a spoonful to his lips, and for a moment he felt the cold sweetness flood his senses, numbing his tongue, filling his chest with an emotion so complex he could not name it. It was joy, shame, longing, and despair all at once. How could this be possible? Back home, his family might be boiling acorns into bitter paste. Children in Tokyo chewed on roots to stave off hunger. Soldiers at the front fought with empty stomachs, collapsing from malnutrition before enemy fire even found them. Yet here, men who had been captured in battle were savoring ice cream, made by machines that seemed to conjure it from nothing. The comparison was unbearable. The camp offered more shocks. There was a movie projector in a recreation hall, flickering Hollywood films onto a white canvas screen. There were sports fields where guards encouraged prisoners to play baseball, a game they only half understood but embraced for the sheer distraction it provided. There were even shelves of books, magazines, and records. These were things the prisoners had been told to expect only in propaganda films, luxuries for the wealthy elite. Yet in America, they appeared as standard provisions, extended even to those who had been sworn enemies. The contrast with Japan's homeland was cruel. Blackout curtains had smothered cities in darkness since 1942. Electricity was rationed so tightly that even radios went silent. Trains stalled for lack of coal, hospitals rationed light bulbs. Families huddled in bomb shelters with only candles. The American camp, by comparison, was ablaze with light and humming with machines that never stopped. Prisoners lay in bunks at night staring at the electric bulbs overhead, their soft glow more demoralizing than any bomb. Tanaka recorded the humiliation in his diary. "We are children watching a carnival of abundance while our homeland starves," They give us ice cream. They give us films. They give us light without end. I thought war was decided by courage, by steel, by sacrifice. But here, I see it decided by machines, by power plants, by factories that never sleep. Our spirit cannot compete with their abundance. Even their prisoners live better than our soldiers. As he wrote, the laughter of fellow prisoners drifted through the barracks, men marveling at the strangeness of eating ice cream after years of hunger. To the Americans, it was nothing. To the Japanese, it was a revelation more terrifying than any weapon. The war was not only lost on the battlefield, it had been lost in the kitchens, the theaters, and the lights of a country that had made luxury its standard, even in the depths of war. And in that realization, Tanaka felt the last illusions of victory collapse, replaced by the crushing certainty that their world had already ended. It was the waste that broke them. If ice cream had shocked Tanaka with its sweetness, it was what the Americans threw away that left him hollow. One afternoon he watched a guard carry a tray out of the mess hall, half a hamburger still resting on the plate. Without hesitation, the soldier tossed it into a metal bin already piled high with crusts of bread, strips of bacon, untouched fruit. A bottle of Coca-Cola, only half empty, clinked against the side before spilling its fizz into the dirt. The guard laughed at something another man said and walked on, never looking back. For Tanaka and his companions, it was like watching treasure buried in the ground. Back in Japan, his mother had written letters filled with despair. The rice ration had fallen to a few ounces per person. Neighbors were boiling grass and bark. Children collapsed in the streets from hunger. In Manchuria, he had seen soldiers gnawing on raw roots, stomachs swollen from malnutrition. Every scrap was hoarded, every crumb treasured. Yet here, in this camp thousands of miles away, food was discarded as if it were less valuable than dirt. Tanaka felt his throat tighten as he imagined his younger brother scraping the bottom of a rice pot, while the Americans poured milk into drains because it had spoiled by a single day. The numbers behind that waste were staggering. America's farms produced more grain than Japan's entire empire could dream of harvesting. In 1944 alone, American farmers harvested over 1 billion bushels of wheat, while Japan struggled to feed even its military. The United States slaughtered millions of cattle, packed billions of cans of meat, and built refrigerated trains that carried beef across the continent as if it were nothing. Japan's supply lines, stretched and strangled, sent soldiers into battle with a single rice ball or nothing at all. The difference was not simply in taste, but in scale, a gulf so wide that no amount of courage could bridge it. One prisoner, a former naval officer, broke down as he watched the bins of discarded food being carted away. He muttered that if even a fraction of this waste had reached Tokyo, children would not be dying in the streets. Another, once a sergeant who had led charges in the Philippines, whispered bitterly that they had been fools, fighting an enemy who could feed its dogs and its prisoners better than Japan fed its soldiers. Tanaka listened and felt the shame press down like an iron weight. He could not deny what his eyes showed him. The waste was not limited to food. Guards smoked cigarettes halfway before tossing them aside, leaving glowing embers to die in the dirt. Gasoline cans sat open, fuel evaporating into the hot air. Trucks idled for hours while their drivers played cards. To the prisoners, every whiff of gasoline carried a sting of humiliation. In Japan, pilots had been grounded for lack of fuel, kamikaze missions flown on sake and pine oil mixtures that barely powered engines into the sky. Men had died begging for a few more liters. Here, Americans let it burn for nothing. Tanaka scribbled furiously in his diary that night, his handwriting jagged. They waste what we die for. They toss aside food that would keep our families alive for weeks. They spill gasoline while our planes fall from the sky for lack of a single tank. The guards laugh, not in cruelty but in indifference. They have so much that they do not even see it. This is not war between nations. This is war between hunger and abundance, between emptiness and excess, and we are on the wrong side. The realization spread like poison through the camp. Men no longer argued about honor or victory. Instead, they sat in silence, staring at the guards with hollow eyes, measuring the chasm between their worlds. The clatter of food dumped into bins echoed louder than any artillery barrage. It was not the sound of kindness nor cruelty. It was the sound of a nation so wealthy, so powerful, that it could afford to treat abundance as disposable. For Tanaka, that sound marked the true end of hope. The war was already over. The only thing left was the humiliation of living long enough to see it. Tanaka thought he had already tasted the depth of humiliation, but the real transformation came not with food or medicine, but in the quiet moments when the truth of defeat sank into his bones. It began with a question that gnawed at him each night as he lay awake on his cot. If they treat us, their enemies, with such generosity, how must they treat their own people? That thought struck harder than any bomb. One afternoon, the prisoners were gathered for labor duty, assigned to clear brush near the camp perimeter. Tanaka looked across the barbed wire at a convoy rolling past on the dusty road. Trucks laden with crates of Coca-Cola, stacked neatly by the hundreds, bounced in the sunlight. Behind them came tankers full of fuel, canvas-covered vehicles hauling spare parts, and wagons carrying mailbags bulging with letters from home. The sight of that endless procession of supplies made his knees weak. In Japan, whole divisions had withered because a single supply ship had been sunk. Here, a prison camp in the middle of nowhere received convoys every day, as if abundance itself was a natural law of the land. The shame deepened when rumors spread of American aircraft that flew thousands of miles without fear, protected by fighters whose existence had been declared impossible. Some guards spoke proudly of the P-51 Mustangs, single-engine fighters that could cross oceans to strike Tokyo and return as if it were routine. The prisoners scoffed at first, until they overheard details that froze their blood. The Mustangs carried nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition, could fly 1,500 miles on drop tanks, and were built so quickly that a new one rolled off American assembly lines every hour. Tanaka remembered his own Air Force, starved of fuel, pilots sent aloft with barely 50 hours of training, engines sputtering on pine oil, and hope. In that comparison, the lie of Japanese propaganda collapsed completely. He recalled the Bushido code drilled into him since boyhood, the lectures that capture meant dishonor worse than death. Yet here he stood, alive, breathing, his wounds healed by enemy medicine, his belly full of enemy food. The code had promised that spirit would triumph over material weakness. But now he saw that spirit alone was powerless against factories, fuel, and logistics that seemed infinite. Courage could win a skirmish, sacrifice could delay a battle. But no number of martyrs could conjure gasoline from tree roots or antibiotics from thin air. The realization struck like a confession. Japan had fought a 19th century war with 20th century weapons, clinging to honor, while America solved war like an engineering problem. For every zero that took to the skies, America produced 10 Mustangs. For every submarine Japan launched, America sank 7 with weapons designed through mathematics and mass production. For every soldier Japan sent to die hungry, America sent 1 carrying chocolate, coffee, and cigarettes. The war had never been equal. It had been a contest of numbers, and the arithmetic was merciless. Tanaka admitted this to himself in the privacy of his diary, though the words shamed him. We were told they were weak. We were told their decadence would undo them. But I see now they are strong because they are decadent. Their strength is not in the sword, but in the machine, the factory, the farm. We bled ourselves dry for the emperor, but against a river of abundance, our sacrifice was nothing more than a drop in the ocean. The more he wrote, the more his bitterness turned into a kind of grim clarity. He had spent his youth believing that honor and endurance could alter the course of nations. But lying in his bunk, under the steady glow of electric light, listening to the hum of refrigerators filled with ice cream, he began to understand that modern war belonged not to warriors, but to production lines. The battle had been lost long before he ever fired his rifle. It had been lost in the mathematics of supply, in the factories of Detroit, in the oil fields of Texas, in the endless convoys that arrived even at a prison camp. It was a cruel awakening, but it was also undeniable. For Tanaka and his comrades, the war was no longer a matter of hope or strategy. It was over, crushed not by the enemy's cruelty, but by his plenty. The humiliation was absolute. Yet in that humiliation lay the first glimmer of a new kind of truth, one that none of them were ready to face but all could see. The emperor's warriors had been defeated, not just on the battlefield, but in the very idea of what strength meant in the modern age. By the summer of 1945, Tanaka's heart no longer raced with shock at every new display of American abundance. The food, the ice cream, the waste, the trucks that arrived daily, they had become routine. And that routine was the most devastating revelation of all. What had once seemed like miracles were in fact normal here. The Americans were not straining to impress prisoners or to stage a performance of generosity. They were simply living as they always did, with a casual certainty that the river of supplies would never run dry. It was in this monotony that the weight of defeat settled fully on his shoulders. One evening, after supper, Tanaka lingered near the kitchen where guards and cooks were finishing their meals. A young American soldier laughed, tossed aside half of his sandwich, and walked out whistling a tune. The discarded food lay on a tray, forgotten. For Tanaka, the sight no longer sparked shock. Instead, it hollowed him out, because he finally understood. This waste was not extravagance. It was evidence of a system so vast, so unshakable, that even indifference could not dent it. America did not ration its kindness or its resources. It had enough to waste. Among the prisoners, conversations turned darker. Some men whispered of home, of families scraping bark from trees to survive, of children begging in bomb-shattered streets. Others cursed their commanders, who had promised victory if only the soldiers endured. But endurance had not saved them. Spirit had not filled their bellies. Sacrifice had not conjured fuel for planes. The truth was now inescapable. Japan had gambled everything on willpower, while America had bet on production, and the outcome was written in the simple act of a soldier tossing away food. Tanaka no longer dreamed of returning to battle. He dreamed instead of factories, of ships, of machines that could produce Coca-Cola by the millions and bombers by the thousands. He realized that the war had never been a contest of courage. It had been a contest of arithmetic. For every Japanese pilot, America trained 10. For every ship Japan built in months, America launched 3 in a day. For every man Japan sent hungry into the jungle, America sent 1 carrying chocolate, cigarettes, and a can of meat. Courage alone could never balance that equation. His diary captured the bitter acceptance. We believed we were warriors of spirit and that they were slaves to comfort. But spirit cannot forge steel, and comfort, when multiplied by machines, becomes power. They are strong because they can afford to be soft. We have been blind. The realization was devastating, yet clarifying. The war was not just lost on the battlefield. It had been lost in the factories, the oil fields, the railroads, the canneries. It had been lost in the ability to feed even enemies better than Japan could feed its own. And in that truth, Tanaka saw not only the collapse of his nation's illusions, but the harsh lesson that the modern age would never again belong to warriors alone. It belonged to those who could produce, supply, and sustain without end. In the stillness of the barracks, surrounded by the low hum of electric fans and the murmurs of men who no longer spoke of honor, Tanaka accepted the war's outcome with a cold clarity. It was not courage that had failed them. It was mathematics, logistics, industry. Against that, No sword, no spirit, no sacrifice could prevail. The humiliation was complete, but so was the truth. The empire had been defeated long before the first prisoner tasted Coca-Cola. It had been defeated by the quiet, relentless power of abundance. When the news of surrender finally reached the camp in mid-August, Tanaka felt no shock. The announcement confirmed what his eyes had already told him for months. As the guards explained in halting Japanese that the emperor's voice had declared the war over, some prisoners wept openly, others collapsed in silence. Tanaka simply closed his diary and stared at the bottle of Coca-Cola he had hidden under his bunk, a relic of the moment when he had first realized everything was lost. The weeks that followed were strangely gentle. The Americans did not gloat, did not mock their captives. Instead, they began to prepare them for the long journey home. New uniforms were issued, plain but clean. Medical checkups ensured no one left the camp sick or untreated. Hot meals continued to arrive 3 times a day, trays filled with meat, bread, fruit, and milk. Some guards even took the time to show prisoners how to cook American dishes, while others sat on the grass with them, sharing stories about farms in Iowa or factories in Detroit. For men who had expected hatred, this quiet humanity was bewildering. Yet beneath the calm, the lessons cut deeper. At staging centers, Tanaka watched as thousands of prisoners were processed with clockwork efficiency. Papers signed, luggage inspected, medical records filed, all done with a precision that felt more like an assembly line than a bureaucracy. Even repatriation was a demonstration of industry. Each man received a package for the voyage: chocolate bars, canned meat, cigarettes, and yes, bottles of Coca-Cola for the crossing. It was as if the Americans wanted to send them back carrying reminders of the abundance they had witnessed, tokens of a power that could not be denied. The ships that bore them across the Pacific were themselves symbols of the war's true victor. Liberty ships, steel giants produced by the thousands, vessels that could be built in weeks rather than years, now carried former enemies back to their ruined homeland. Tanaka stood at the rail of one such ship as it steamed into Tokyo Bay in December 1945. In his hand, he clutched that same Coca-Cola bottle, now nearly empty. He lifted it to his lips for one final sip as the devastated skyline of his city came into view. Factories lay in ruins, docks choked with wreckage, entire districts flattened by firebombs. Against this desolation, the memory of American convoys and ice cream machines burned even brighter. He wrote in his diary with a hand steadier than ever before. We fought as if spirit alone could win, but they fought with factories. We sacrificed ourselves for the emperor, but they fed even their prisoners with more than we could give our own soldiers. We believed we lived in the modern age, but we were still fighting the last century. The truth is cold, but undeniable. In this new world, strength is measured not by honor, but by production. In the years that followed, many men like Tanaka became unwilling bridges between two worlds. They carried home stories of abundance that seemed like fairy tales to starving families. They spoke of ice cream in prison camps, of Coca-Cola trucks, of electric lights that never dimmed. And as Japan rebuilt from the ashes, those stories turned into lessons. The factories that rose from the rubble copied the efficiency they had seen in captivity. The new Japan embraced mass production, standardization, and consumer goods. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola was bottled in Tokyo, hamburgers sold on every street corner, and ice cream became a treat for children across the nation. The humiliation of defeat had become the blueprint for rebirth. What had once symbolized weakness now guided transformation. For Tanaka, the bitter taste of surrender never faded, but neither did the clarity of what he had learned. The war had taught him that courage alone was useless against an enemy who could outproduce, outfeed, and outlast every sacrifice. The real victory in 1945 belonged not to warriors, but to the factories, the convoys, the endless flow of abundance. And in that lesson lay the future, not just for America, but for Japan itself. The war was over, but the message remained. In the modern age, true power is not measured by how much one can endure, but by how much one can create.